Here's your host, Alex Garrett.
So what is going on our streets in New York City, and with everything going on with the police department, everything with police reform? I thought my next guest, Florence Finkle, who's been, in New York City as an assistant DA, and then she worked with the Civilian Complaint Review Board here in New York, all of it, and Department of Corrections. I thought Florence would be a great person to talk to from NACOLE, which, by the way, is National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. Florence, first of all, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
So what are you seeing that maybe people just reading the headlines aren't seeing? Because you've had experience in this. So what are you seeing around the shifting, around the movements, around the police reform that maybe no one else is seeing right now or doesn't want to see?
I'm not sure that I would say that, but the death of George Floyd seems to be another catalyst for a groundswell of support that we haven't seen in, in many, many, many years for comprehensive reform and rethinking of policing in the United States.
And it is something that has stuck. I mean, right? This tragedy has stuck with us. Whereas maybe you disagree, but sometimes when an incident happens like this, the media kind of goes away. The coverage goes away after a little while. This one has stuck more so than the others. Would you say that that's accurate?
I mean, given my experience, I think there's just the number of protests, the number of cities in which protests have been held, the composition of the protesters is broader than anything I think we've seen in decades. I'm a board member of the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, and I also worked for 11 years as a leader, a deputy executive director, and executive director for the Civilian Complaint Review Board in New York City. And my experience is that at least civilian oversight of law enforcement agencies grow out of individual controversial incidents in cities, and then there's a conversation that ensues. How can we make things better? How can we improve policing? How can we involve civilians in policing? And often municipalities will create some sort of civilian oversight as a result of these kinds of incidents, but usually it's very local. So in New York City, for example, the Independent Civilian Complaint Review Board grew out of Tompkins Square Park riots when the Dinkins administration moved to clear out Tompkins Square Park, which had become a homeless encampment, and there were ensuing kind of riots, and some of it, this was in the early 90s, was recorded on video, and long before the cell phone era, and pictures, film of officers covering their badges and hitting protesters with batons, and that sort of led to a movement by the Dinkins administration to create a civilian complaint review board that was independent of the police department. It had previously been a unit within the police department.
And how has that oversight gone?
What we're seeing now is much, much, much bigger than that.
And how has the Civilian Complaint Review Board been going along since its inception? Have you seen it progress or regress, or what have you seen from the board itself as we move along in time?
Well, I worked at the board from 96 to 2007, so 3 years after it had been created, and 13 years ago at this point. And it was beset early on by a lot of problems, underfunding, understaffing, insufficient period of time to basically create an agency. It was only given 6 months to start, and they were sort of behind the 8 ball from the get-go. But today, so it's taken along. It's a very mature agency at this point. It's an investigative agency, and it makes recommendations to the police department based on its investigative findings, and also now has the power to administratively prosecute the most significant cases. It substantiates that power commenced in 2013 with an agreement with the police department. Has a $20 million budget and has over 200 employees. So it's definitely the largest civilian oversight agency in the country, and it built into the legislation, it has a lot of authority. Police have to cooperate with the CCRB, or they can risk being fired. The agency has subpoena authority, and so, I mean, it has significant authority that, you know, a lot of other maybe civilian oversight agencies don't have in the country. And it's not the only civilian oversight of the police that exists in New York City.
And, you know, what's interesting is that's in 2013 that really got its sort of launch. It got to be bigger and better. And wouldn't you know, a year later, Garner's death, and that still rattles the city. Wouldn't you say that that whole tragedy in Staten Island still rattles the city to this day?
Well, I'm not a poll taker, but it's definitely, there are echoes of the Eric Garner case with the George Floyd death, minor offenses. Someone dies because of asphyxiation. And I believe that, you know, protesters are certainly invoking Eric Garner's name in the, you know, current protests. But I wouldn't necessarily say that the agency only got its teeth in 2013. That's just a significant expansion of its authority that made it more effective in 2013. The power to have CCRB lawyers conduct the administrative prosecutions of substantiated cases before an NYPD trial judge, and it was the CCRB that conducted the administrative trial of the officer responsible for Eric Garner's death, and that led finally to his termination.
Right, and you know the board has come under fire at times, but what would you say to those critics, like to change the narrative of what that board does?
Well, civilian oversight of law enforcement is not a panacea to fixing the police. It's just one initiative that communities can take to try to make the police departments more transparent, to make the accountability systems more transparent, to try to impact police department policy and operations. In New York City, frankly, we have, relative to what exists in the rest of the country, we have a fairly robust civilian oversight of the police. So in addition to the Civilian Complaint Review Board, which investigates complaints filed by members of the public against NYPD sworn officers involving force, abuse of authority, discourtesy, and offensive language, we also have the NYPD Inspector General, which was created at the end of the Bloomberg administration. It's housed within the Department of Investigation, the Inspector General for the city, and that is kind of a monitor of the police department. It doesn't really investigate individual complaints, but it analyzes NYPD operations and writes reports recommending changes to those operations or training or policies and procedures. So, for example, early on in its tenure, it issued a report on NYPD uses of force and use of force reporting, and as a result of that study, the police department required officers to prepare a use of force report, which it had never done before. And we also, there's a third commission that people don't usually know about. This was created during the Giuliani era as a result of an executive order called the Commission to Combat Police Corruption. And that commission is donations to the police department.
From your experience, is what the NYPD is doing right now, with just shifting around resources, is that going to help us in the long run? Or what would you say to those shifts happening now?
Hard to say. I mean, I think these things are just in beginning stages of what they're doing. I mean, I think the biggest thing to have happened so far is the repeal of Civil Rights Law Section 50A, which protected the personnel files of firefighters, correction officers, and police officers in New York State, and concealed them from public view and Freedom of Information Act requests. And while people often focus on the importance of seeing individual officers' complaint histories, what's, I think, really important about the repeal of that statute is that it's going to open up and make transparent the internal disciplinary, the accountability systems that exist within police departments and correction departments around the state. And that's very significant. Right now, for example, or prior to the repeal of 50A, trial judges' decisions in the NYPD were not subject to, they were not public. Now they're going to be public. The police department's going to have to, we're going to see what kind of discipline is meted out against officers charged with certain offenses. And the public can make a decision about whether the department is appropriately disciplining officers who violate department policy. And
I don't know, there's an estimate, but what would you say we would find from the 50A? Because I think instead of painting the whole police department as racist or anything, I think these individual files will be a lot more beneficial than just making sort of broad brush statements. Would you agree?
I'm not sure I would frame it that way. I think it's important to see, so for example, if officers are found guilty of improperly using a baton against a civilian, we would want to see what kind of discipline is meted out over time against those officers, and whether we as members of the public who invest the police with a tremendous amount of authority, they can arrest us, they can stop and search us, they can use force against us. And we as taxpayers and their employers and the people who invest them with this kind of authority, I think have the right to see whether, if take that example, an officer improperly uses a baton, in some cases injuring civilians, whether they're being appropriately disciplined. And if not, what changes should be made to ensure that they are?
And hopefully we see that. Now, one of the other reasons why I brought you on is because I do want to know, others have been talking about how community policing is a must. We have to have them in our areas where there could be a lot more crime. Is that accurate? Like, do inner city communities want police there? I guess is my question.
I can't answer that question. First, community policing has a lot of different definitions.
Okay.
And police departments use that term in a lot of different ways. So I can't really say what community policing consists of in different communities, and that's not really my area of expertise. But even though there's a defund the police movement, I would surmise that I think the polls are starting to show this, most Americans don't think police departments should be abolished. They just want them to be better.
As district attorney, you've been at this for quite a while. So what cases that you worked on could we learn from today?
I served as an assistant district attorney in the Manhattan DA's office from 1987 through to 1996. And for the last couple of years of my tenure, I was assigned to the official corruption unit, and I worked on the investigation into corruption at the 30th Precinct in New York City, where approximately 30 officers were convicted of federal and state crimes from a single precinct. and I ended up trying 3 cases involving officers who had perjured themselves to conceal unlawful searches and seizures. I'm not sure that there's that kind of rampant corruption that is existing today. A lot of this was driven by the crack epidemic, and officers basically shook down people. They stopped people unlawfully. They stole money from drug dealers. In their cars, they stopped them on the street. They took keys from them. They went into apartments and searched them for drugs and money. They made up facts to justify arrests. But certainly we've seen police perjury, or testifying as it's commonly referred to, is still pernicious and still a problem. I'm not involved in internal affairs or, overseeing that aspect of the department. I don't work currently in a DA's office, so it would be hard for me to say that kind of thing still exists today. But these things tend to come in cycles, and right now we're talking about police use of force, but it could cycle back to, typical police corruption, but certainly falsifying reports and speaking or testifying intentionally testifying untruthfully about incidents. I mean, it's a kind of a human compulsion, so it's a part of police departments where you're trying to cover up wrongdoing.
What is the police union's role? I mean, I would not like to think they cover up, but how have they been working with either NACOLE or the CCRB? How has that relationship been with the union for officers?
Well, that's a big question that a lot of people are discussing today. I mean, up until this last week in New York, and up until last year, the last 2 years, last year maybe in California and New York, 2 of the most liberal states in the country, had the most secretive rules governing police department personnel files and access to disciplinary records. And I don't think that's a coincidence, because these states are big union states, and the unions wielded a tremendous amount of authority. And that resulted in basically keeping accountability systems secret in both states. So that's changed. California changed its law, and now New York has changed its law. And I think what most people are disturbed about, most progressives, I support unions, but I think what is disturbing to people is that police have been able to collectively bargain for things well beyond wages and benefits, that they can, certain collective bargaining agreements involve provisions that go to the heart of, they can set the terms of internal investigation timelines and what information police officers should have access to before they're compelled to submit to an interview. They can set forth how the disciplinary process works within a department and what appeal avenues the officers have if they're subject to discipline. And there's been a lot of articles recently about how they have perverted, even if you have a police chief and top management who want to be a reformer, want to be tough on discipline, they're stymied by these collective bargaining agreements that liberal mayors have signed off on.
Well, all this stuff, first of all, why wasn't any of this repealing and then even moving of the funds done in 2014 after the outrage over Eric Garner? How come it took this? How come it didn't happen sooner?
I can't answer that question, but there have been people who've been advocating for repeal of 50A for years, mainly the Civil Liberties Union and the Legal Aid Society, and there was litigation within the courts to try to have the courts interpret it more liberally, and that litigation was unsuccessful. So it was up to the state legislature. I think a lot of people were optimistic that once the Democrats in New York State took control of the state Senate, in addition to the Assembly, which they had long dominated, that last year the legislature would have repealed or at least modified 50A. It didn't happen. It didn't happen until you've seen this massive protest and outrage at policing in the United States that's persisted now for weeks of people being in the streets. So they had to act now, and they didn't feel that they had to act last year. I mean, last year, how many people knew what 50A was? It's an insider baseball game. I mean, now I have friends who have no experience in really, police oversight or policing, and they're talking to me about 50A. A year ago, they wouldn't have known what it was.
A year ago, I think we were just going along our own ways, and then all of this happened right, in March with COVID, and now we're kind of all a little more aware of what's going on. Wouldn't you say that's also been a factor, that we're more aware of this?
I think that people are only aware of what 50A was after George Floyd's death.
Right.
I don't think that it has anything to do with COVID, really.
You guys at NACOLE, the National Association of Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement.
It's an reform that has been discussed for years.
Right. You guys do want to build trust in law enforcement, though, right? I mean, that's your goal at NACOLE. I'm here. Can you hear me? Florence, can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Sorry.
I said, yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
The goal of... Hello?
I'm here. Yeah, the goal of NACOLE, you were saying?
I'll just read you from NACOLE's mission statement, really. It's, let's see here. NACOLE's, which again is the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, its mission is to create a community of support for independent civilian oversight entities that seek to make the local law enforcement agencies transparent, accountable, and responsible to the communities they serve.
And so, but that also does help instill faith in the departments themselves, right? Like, if there's oversight, then we know that there are still good people on the force. Is that also a goal?
One of the ideas behind civilian oversight is to enhance public trust in the department, to make policing more effective. If members of the public don't trust police departments, they're not going to cooperate, and they're not going to report crime, they're not going to cooperate with investigations, they may thwart authority in kind of the ways that we've seen on the streets. And the idea was that there's different models of civilian oversight. There's monitors, there's investigative models, but the idea was that if you don't believe that the police can police the police, and you invest some authority for internal investigations or administrative disciplinary investigations to civilians, or give civilians the power to review departmental policies and operations and make recommendations, then the public might have more faith in the department, because the public's playing more of a role
in deciding it.
Internal investigation, yeah.
What would you say, though, to those that want to abolish? Because from what I hear, you don't want to abolish the NYPD, you don't want to abolish police, but for that sector, what would be your message? That no, we can't let them go completely.
I think the majority of people believe that policing might be reimagined, or maybe we should refocus the police's efforts on fighting crime. And I think there's a lot to be said for, in the NYPD, the police academy is 6 months. In other countries, it's a lot longer. And in other cities, it's a lot shorter. And maybe the police aren't the best qualified to respond to problems of the homeless. We've delegated as the public, we have dumped on police departments some of the most undesirable tasks that no one else wants to handle, where government has basically fawned off on the police and cut other resources to deal with. So is policing really the best way to get, most people don't want homeless on the street.
Right.
Are the police the best way to provide housing for homeless people, most of whom are mentally ill or have some sort of drug issue? Are the police officers the best qualified to respond to calls involving possibly dangerous mentally ill individuals? I think there's a majority of thinking at this point in time that maybe they're not, and we need to come up with a different solution.
And, they also have the task force. I've seen them on the subways. When I came home late at night, I'd see them trying to help out the homeless. Have those efforts been effective where regular, non-uniformed people just go up to them and say, hey, do you need help or something like that? I've seen that too.
I'm really not qualified to comment
Okay.
on the success or failure of the city's current efforts to, deal with homeless,
Sure.
deal with the homeless. I'm not qualified to comment on that.
Well, and I want to get you back because I also see you dealt with Medicaid fraud, and that's something that's eaten me up a lot on this podcast at times. So we'll have you back on that. But yesterday, the executive order is done for police reform. Did you like it? Could things have done better? What are your thoughts on that?
On the Trump's presidential executive order?
Yeah, what would you say to that? It's perfect timing to talk to you about it, actually.
I would say that the thing that the president could do that might be most effective is reinvigorate the Department of Justice's Special Civil Rights Division, Special Litigation Unit's role in conducting pattern and practice investigations of law enforcement agencies, and in cases where they find a pattern and practice of constitutional violations, threaten to sue, and most municipalities don't want to fight the feds in court, and they sign a settlement agreement with the United States, and the city then has to meet terms in the consent decree over period of these consent decrees last many, many years. And changing culture in departments takes time. It's not going to happen in 6 months. It doesn't happen in a year. And one of my other experiences last year, I worked with the monitor overseeing the consent decree between the Department of Justice and the Seattle Police Department.
And by the way, they are dealing with something up there now. So what have you talked to them through all of this Chaz movement going on up there? Occupation?
Not specifically with oversight professionals there. There are 2 members of our NACOLE board that are from the Seattle area. But no, I don't have enough information about what's going on the ground there. As far as I know, it's fairly peaceful. But you can't have an occupying. You can't get on the streets for like a year. So
exactly.
I'm sure everyone's hoping for a peaceful resolution.
Does NACOLE work closely with Mayor de Blasio, Governor Cuomo, and the NYPD? Like, are you guys on all factions with each institution of our city?
NACOLE is a national organization. It's comprised of approximately 250 to 260 members, most of which are organizational memberships, organizations that employ hundreds and hundreds of people working as civilian oversight practitioners. Then there are individual members, founders, and lifetime members. And we conduct, our real goal is, as I said, create a community of support for those involved in civilian oversight of law enforcement. And a lot of what we do is to provide training to our members and friends of NACOLE who come to annual conferences, regional training conferences, listen to our webinars, or come come to our academic symposiums.
Well, on that note, then, do you think civilian complaint boards get stiff-armed or strong-armed into not doing certain things, or are they pretty well strong enough to not get bullied into certain decisions?
Most civilian oversight entities in the United States are not properly funded. They don't have sufficient independence. They don't have sufficient authority. They don't have sufficient access to NYPD records. They have insufficient staff. So it's hard to criticize civilian oversight entities when the public hasn't sufficiently given them teeth to be more effective than they are.
And this is also why I brought you on, the community boards themselves. I mean, do they have a say in what goes on with the police in their communities in and of itself?
When you say community board, what are you talking about?
Like in these different zones, they have different community boards that meet, that have those town hall meetings and decide for their...
You mean like in New York City?
Yeah.
The community boards?
Yes, yep.
I mean, I would imagine, this CCRB has like in New York City, and in most jurisdictions that have any kind of civilian oversight, usually one of their mandates is to have a robust public outreach program to inform the public about what they do, what they're empowered to do, and what they do. And I know, having been the deputy executive director and executive director of the CCRB in New York City, that our representatives oftentimes spoke at community boards or precinct councils and the like, and their community outreach staff now is a lot bigger than what ours was in the late 90s and early aughts.
How can people help NACOLE today? Like, how can we help you guys make this city and make this country better when it comes to police-community relations?
Well, they can go to the NACOLE website and donate. We're a not-for-profit. We're not an advocacy organization. I mean, in terms of, we're not a political advocacy organization. And our goal is to help existing civilian oversight entities and to help jurisdictions who are considering civilian oversight pick the strongest model for them, pick the most effective, strongest model for them. And we often conduct contracted trainings for those jurisdictions. So they can donate, they can become a member of NACOLE, and they can get involved in their local communities.
And one more question. When you say jurisdictions are created, would you say when you try to go into different areas and instill something, there's like, people are afraid of change still, or are people getting more open to the idea of oversight, even in the heart of America?
I've seen a lot of articles in the last couple of weeks about all of a sudden certain communities are considering establishing some sort of civilian oversight, but these proposals should be well thought out. The municipality should research what has worked and what doesn't around the country. They should pick models and they should enact legislation and pick models that will result in effective oversight practices. Just having, a commission or a board and saying that that's civilian oversight really is not adequate.
Florence, I know you're on Twitter because that's how we connected. What's your Twitter, though, for people that can follow you and what you're up to daily?
Oh, my God, I barely know. I think it's at Florence Finkle.
All right, so I'll redirect people there. And this was a great first conversation. Please come back as this whole thing develops and let us know what you're seeing.
Okay, thank you for having me.
I'm Alex Garrett. We'll talk to you soon.